It was spring of 1995, and Peter and I were living with our 2 young children in the little town of Spring Church, Pennsylvania. I was working as a part-time associate pastor, which basically meant I worked 2 days during the week and on Sunday. The day I'm remembering was a weekday on which I was at home. Emily was in 1st grade, so she was at school. Ethan was about 4.5 years old, so he was at home. The house was basically quiet, and I was trying to get some work done around the house. Suddenly, I heard a thud from my living room that was so loud it was startling. It was not at all a normal house noise, and yet I had an idea what the noise might have been. I had heard a familiar noise a couple times before, and likely some of you have as well. I went into my living room, looked up at that big front window, and yep, there was a mark. Next, I went to the front door and I opened it. As I stepped outside, I looked to my right, to the ground beneath that front window, and sure enough, it was a bird. It was a robin, to be specific. The bird was not moving, and believe me, it was not looking good. I took a stick and I just sort of gently nudged the robin a bit, but nothing, no response at all. Since I considered bearing a bird Peter's job, and he was still working at the church, he was there that day, I left the bird there. Over the next couple of hours, I checked on that bird probably 2 or 3 times, and each time the lifeless body was still in the exact same spot. After Emily got home from school, I got busy with the 2 kids, and eventually I started making dinner. So I stopped checking. When Peter got home, I told him about the bird that needed to be buried. I took him to the front door, showed him, and guess what? The bird was gone. I could have sworn that bird was dead. But apparently I was wrong. Of course, I was glad that the bird was alive. And yet it's rather unnerving, isn't it, when something that appears to be dead ends up not being dead. In the normal course of events, what is dead stays dead. And if it comes back to life again, well, it wasn't really dead in the first place. Even though that bird appeared lifeless to me, there was obviously life that I simply could not see. Consider for a moment. Creatures that hibernate for maybe months at a time, their bodily functions slow way down, and yet those functions do not completely stop. There is still life in them. There are also creatures with the ability to regenerate themselves when given enough time, like a starfish that loses an arm and grows another one, or like a man or a woman suffering from a brain injury and in a deep coma for maybe a period of time, but who then wakes up. All of these things, of course, are miracles enough for us. But resurrection is a miracle of another order. Spark of life is totally extinguished. There's no heartbeat. There's no brain activity. Death occurs beyond a shadow of a doubt. The living withdraw to get on with their lives, and the silence of absence remains. It is then, when everything is over, that something entirely unexpected, something new begins. What was cold becomes warm. What was lifeless and still sits up and moves. Creation occurs all over again. It's not a spark that is rescued from the ashes, but a whole new fire that is kindled from nothing. It is a gracious act, an act from the only one who can create life from dust, not just once upon a time, or even at the end of all time, but over and over and over again. if you and I do not believe in a God who is able to bring forth life from death, then the Apostle Paul says of us, we are of all people most to be pitied. And yet, the resurrection of the dead in general and the bodily resurrection of Jesus in particular are hard for some to completely swallow. In their mind, they just can't make sense of it. In their experience, they just haven't known it to be true. There are good and faithful people who say that it does not matter to them whether the resurrection really happened or not, because they would still do their best to live by Jesus' wonderful teachings. There are others who say they firmly believe in the resurrection, and yet their lives never seem to really bear witness to a living Lord. Still others say it was the survival of the Spirit, Jesus' Spirit, that really mattered most, and that too much thinking about what happens after we die distracts us from what we should be doing while we are yet alive. Now, the truth of the matter is that resurrection is nothing any of us have ever seen or experienced for ourselves. Near-death experiences, perhaps, but none of us knows firsthand what it is like to be resurrected from the dead. According to the Bible, God set it up that way. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of people witnessed Jesus' crucifixion, but not one living soul was there when he was raised from the dead. The women, they saw him when he was back on his feet. And his disciples, well, they saw him after that for a period of about 40 days. But no one was allowed the privilege of seeing Jesus come back to life. Resurrection is not something we can test, like gravity or true north. It is a non-material reality, a mystery. And that is one reason why Paul was pushing it so hard on those people who were members of the church in Corinth. You see, Corinthians were known to be the champion materialists of that day. They were big eaters and drinkers. They liked their things. They liked having a good time, and they preferred their religious truths to have immediate and visible results. For them, seeing was mostly believing, and anything that happened outside their day-to-day experience was not of really much interest to them. They were the type of people who preferred not to think too much about death. They preferred going for all the gusto in life that they could get. By pushing resurrection, Paul was challenging them to believe that life was more than what they could see, taste, touch. He wanted them to know that there was a dimension, a reality, a quality of life that was all but invisible to them. And yet it was so much more powerful and real than anything their human senses could detect. Paul knew that if they missed out on that profound truth, then they were people to be pitied. Paul was not one to let up or compromise, because he was driven by his own personal encounter with the resurrected Christ. It happened for him on the road to Damascus, when suddenly there was that flash of light, and Paul was confronted by a commanding voice from out of nowhere. His life, his purpose was completely transformed by someone who was supposedly dead and gone. Paul learned all that he needed to know about resurrection in that blinding moment. He learned that God has the power beyond all human standing. He learned that life is stronger than death, and that none of us have the insight or the experience to be able to say for sure that everything is over, everything is done with. If God can raise the dead, and just as important, if we believe God can raise the dead, then our despair will always be temporary, and our hope will be invincible. None of this is because of us, but because God has never, ever forgotten how to breathe life into dust. We do not know exactly what resurrection will mean for us in the end. We cannot know how it will feel or work or exactly look like, but what we do know is that Jesus was dead. The Romans, who were experts at crucifixion, made sure of it. We know Jesus' body was laid in a tomb on Friday and that a huge stone was rolled across the entrance. We know that early on Sunday morning, women went to the tomb, found the stone rolled away and the tomb empty. We know that an angel appeared and said, "He is not here. Come, see the place where he lay. Then go and tell his disciples, he has been raised from the dead." We know that Jesus then appeared to the women who had come to the tomb. He appeared to his disciples and others over those next 40 days. He appeared to Paul, and he appeared to countless others throughout the centuries. Even 2,000 years after Jesus' resurrection, and at a time such as this, we have evidence that Jesus is alive and that God continues to bring forth life from death. As precious gifts and reminders to us, God has actually woven glimpses of resurrection into his creation and into our daily lives. Living in the north like we all do, I'm thinking how every spring we witness an amazing display of new life. Spring flowers, well, they've already broken through the ground, and some of them are now blooming in our yards. The trees that have been bare and have appeared dead for months are beginning to bud. Creatures that were hibernating during the coldest and the darkest days of winter are stirring. But besides these creation reminders, I'm also thinking about a man, a teacher, who was basically fired about 6 months short of his scheduled retirement after 25 years of teaching. It was a nasty piece of work on the part of his superiors. It was punishment for challenging them. It was making him an example for anyone else thinking about trying to do the same thing. It was called an early retirement. And they gave him a party, which he suffered through. "I've been to my own funeral," he said himself weeks later. "I lost my students, my program, my livelihood, my pride. But you know what? There really is life after death. I'm doing things I always wanted to do but never had time to do. I'm finding energy I thought I'd lost forever, purpose I never previously had. Getting crucified turned out better than I thought it would." I'm thinking of a woman diagnosed tragically with Lou Gehrig's disease in her 50s, and who surprised everyone around her by growing more and more alive spiritually as she died physically. Her nervous system quit on her inch by inch, After she lost the ability to speak, she took up watercoloring. She continued team teaching weekend workshops on faith, even though she could only communicate by typing on a screen and through the inspirational glow of her face and determination of her spirit. When she died, surrounded by her family, surrounded by her friends, they bore witness to the fact that she was as alive as anyone they'd ever known. These are not exactly resurrection stories like the one we celebrate today, because the mystery, the glory that is Jesus' resurrection is known fully and only to God. And yet, they are true stories about the raising of the dead and the gift of new life. They are stories of people who were laid low and by all rights should never rise again, but who suddenly sit up in their ashes, brush themselves off, and go to live in a powerfully new way. It may be entirely unnatural, but it is how God works, now and forever. Of course, we know that death is a part of life. And whereas this reality is rarely easy for us, these recent weeks have been especially difficult. We are caught up right now in a reality that is filling us with so much uncertainty, and that uncertainty is fear, it's death itself. This reality is having a profound impact on each one of us. And yet, Easter Sunday has arrived. And we are reminded once again that God's will for us is life, not death. To miss the truth of God's resurrection power is to be a people without hope. But for those of us who believe it, well, our hope shall never die. Easter boldly declares to us that it is possible to survive the pain and the suffering of crucifixion. Yes, it is possible to survive the worst this life dishes out, including death. Therefore, if you believe that Jesus is alive, if you have ever experienced God's life-giving touch, then, like those women at Jesus' tomb early on the first day of the week, go and bear witness to the only power that raises the dead to new life. And right now, from our current state of separation, let us raise our voices as we joyfully proclaim, "The Lord is risen and reigns forever." Alleluia. Amen.